Question asking is one of the most important aspects of problem solving. If someone only asks one or two questions, first, well, how is it done before? I don't want them on my team for the most part, unless they're going to ask more questions. If you ask that question, it's only for information, not because you're going to listen to that, whatever that was. You have to remember that how problems were solved in the past may be for the best for the situation in the past, but we no longer live in the past. We live in a different world. One, that problem may not have been for you. And since I've worked with governments so freaking long, I understand how a lot of solutions have come to be. It just, somebody made up a decision who was in the right place at the right time or the right authority, and it was the best that they could come up with. And they sometimes even thought that somebody would just improve it later, but no one ever did.
How do young men like us optimize our lives in a way that lets us achieve success and meaning? Come with me as I interview top performers and delve into key areas of life: habits, finance, psychology, health, relationships, work, creativity, and business. I boil the ocean of men's advice into usable wisdom in this podcast to give you the answers. My name is Blake Bottrell, and this is the Distilled Podcast. My guest today is the human embodiment of at least this will be a great story later. From thinking she was dying at the age of 35 to almost being thrown in an Ecuadorian prison. From having her photography selected to be in the Canadian version of Monopoly, to building an AI version of one of her closest friends. From educating Kenyans about new tax legislation to being the managing partner of a grain farm in rural Alberta. She's on a mission to make the world a better place by sharing her knowledge and teaching the world about why polymaths are going to win. Samantha Postman, welcome to the show.
Wow. Oh my gosh, Blake. Okay, you did your homework.
It's definitely something we like to do over here. So,
wow.
I wanted to sort of start with this idea because you're so deep into polymath learning and polymath thinking, of this concept of luck by uniqueness. It was a book written in 1978 that this idea has been circulating for those of us who are chronically online, that there's 4 different types of luck: blind luck, luck from motion, luck from awareness, and luck from uniqueness. And the idea of a polymath perfectly fits this luck from uniqueness idea. And you have many unique examples, I'm sure, but the one that comes to mind from the intro is this idea of teaching tax legislations to Kenyans on Twitter Spaces. So I was wondering if you could maybe speak to the effect of being a polymath and executing this luck by uniqueness strategy.
Yeah, for sure. Let's start off with just explaining what a polymath is, in case anyone in your audience doesn't know what a polymath is. So most people know who Leonardo da Vinci is, and Leonardo da Vinci was multidisciplinary. So a polymath is someone who is multidisciplined. I'm not the polymath police, but generally speaking, at least 3 masteries. There's a spectrum of polymathy, is what I'll use the word polymathy. So to become a polymath, it's generally accepted you need to be quite good in at least 3 disciplines. I've coined this term called polythinker, which is really somebody who's polymathic. So someone who's on that spectrum moving towards it. And there's different paths to that. The uniqueness comes by combining, when you start combining disciplines, because if you've got like a whole bunch of people who are trained in, let's say, I'll use your background, engineering. I noticed that you have an engineering background. So what kind of engineering did you take in school, Blake?
I was in school for the original thing that I did was a year-long general engineering program at McMaster, and then ended up doing a college program that was about a year and a half, and didn't really complete either one. But in doing that, I found out what I didn't want to do, so that was good.
Okay, well, that's a good example. So general engineering, they're taking you a bit of everything. So when you start out, you've got this like top of funnel, if you will. So we'll go down. So, this large funnel and a lot of people. I'm actually going to go the other way. Let's do the pyramid, because for polymathy, I like to use the pyramid the other way. So at the bottom, you've got this base level where everybody's got similar training, similar experience, especially the school system. And so every time you tier a skill on that other people don't have, you've now narrowed it, which makes you more unique. There's less of you. So the more you add, the more you tier. Like, look at Leonardo da Vinci. Look at how many disciplines he has, I mean, you get this tiny little square at the top, or sorry, this tiny little triangle at the top that becomes very unique. And some people will use, like pyramids or like that triangle that we see sometimes in that Illuminati, this idea of this triangle at the top. But that's a unique insight because they're able to pull from so many diverse ways of thinking that other people just can't do when you're down at the beginning level. So I don't like to say bottom, but I would just say like in the general pool, if you will. So the more unique you are, yeah, I guess the more luck. That could go both ways. You know, sometimes the problem with being so unique at times is that people just don't know where to put you because people like boxes, and the bigger your box, the easier it is for people to place you. I'll just take something simple: males and females, box, box. Now people are trying to move those boxes around, but it's very easy to put people in boxes, if you will. So the harder you are to put in a box, the harder it is for people to understand you and know how to utilize you.
For sure. I think based on the polarization of the world and people's necessity to almost put people in boxes, there's, like you're saying, not a like, I think obviously that the benefits of these being able to cross boxes has much more inherent advantage than not being able to be placed in boxes by people. But I can certainly see where you could encounter friction in terms of dealing with other people when attempting to cross some of these boundaries that you're talking about.
And people will force you into them. So because it's comfortable for them. And that's a difficult thing. So when you're talking about this like luck surface, if you will, I think that somebody who has unique skill set knows how they fit. So they'll go to someone and say, hey, I can help you with this. But if the other person doesn't understand how that fits, then they'll not really let you go into that spot. So I don't know that luck, if actually in a lot of ways, polymaths sometimes are less successful than people who are just specialists because, and I don't think it's a lack of intellectualism or a lack of skill. It's a lack of other people understanding how to utilize the person's skill set. So it's society that's holding back the generalists or polymathic types than it is the actual polymath themselves. Of course, we can talk about that later. There are some things that hold a polymath back as well. But I think that in the new, what we call the new Renaissance or modern Renaissance, some people calling it the new Renaissance, or sorry, neo-Renaissance, which basically means new and modern, we're definitely starting to see a lot more people accepting and starting to look for them. And what we sometimes call, like what you're calling uniqueness, sometimes we'll call like the purple unicorn. And that became very popular with Silicon Valley, of course, in the tech department or the tech world. And so like if a polymath can, somebody who's polymathic can start to use terms that people are more used to using, that will really help them a lot because companies are looking for purple unicorns. People can do pretty much everything and fairly well. And so using a term that people use can be helpful too.
For sure. You talk about a lot of the vision that comes as part of the association with being a generalist and being able to see all these different things. The example you use a lot is Steve Jobs, obviously talking about the tech world. So just coming back to the idea that generalists are sort of, in your opinion, and I definitely see the advantage to having that generalist mindset and agree with that assessment, is why is it important that people start to branch out and become more of a generalist or follow down the path and fully become a polymathic?
Okay, well, I'm going to go back to the Kenyan example because I didn't quite answer that yet. I got all stuck up on the uniqueness stuff, but I think that those two really go well together. Well, first of all, life is freaking boring if you're doing the same thing all the time. So like, even just for having a nice, interesting life, like, isn't that just worth it at all for everything? Like, I get that a specialist can, not always, by the way, because of course we're always using specific examples that, suit people's statistical preference, but a specialist can make an insane amount of money compared to sometimes a polymath. However, I will say that they're just doing the same thing all the time. So, yeah, there's variances within their field, but like personally for me, I would just like, that's in some ways to me like a prison, and it's not like that for everyone. Like, I sort of like to use this image sometimes. Some people like to be in a cage. I'll use the word cage because to a polymath, that's a cage. They like to be in it because the food comes to them. They're comfortable within their area. They can just sit back and watch TV, and they're very comfortable in a very, I'll call a cage. Other people, like animals, you go to the zoo, some animals are completely happy in that cage, like they're doing fine, or they adapt very well, they do fine, they can thrive in it. Other ones, the lion is freaking walking that thing, walking the perimeter constantly, banging on the glass, so there different types of people are the same way. And so if you don't want to be confined to one glass cage or whatever you want to call it, well, go for it. But I just think that life is too short to not have an interesting life, and everything isn't about money. So I'm going to go to my the Kenyan example that you gave me for anyone who's not listening, who doesn't know. I used to be on Twitter Spaces a lot. When they first came out, I was a beta host tester and did over hundreds of them. And through that, I met a lot of people. And I met a guy who was actually selected one of, I feel like 14 of the entire world to do a socialist movement with the United Nations Foundation. And so I worked with him for quite a while, voluntary position, where we worked with people across Africa in just improving their wellness. Okay, so he was called the digital humanitarian. And so then I worked with him for quite a bit. And through that, he was very well known in Kenya for lots of reasons, very influential. And he knew that I had this tax background. So I used to be a tax accountant by first trade. I've done over 7,500 tax returns. And yeah, that's the specialty. There's a lot within that specialty. And so he said to me, hey, Kenyans running into this new tax. It's called digital tax. It's for people who are selling digital products and things like that. So the governments, of course, want to have a portion of that. They're just trying to educate Kenyans about it. And so he knew that I had it. But here's the thing. Because I know Twitter Spaces, I knew social audio. I'm a social audio expert. Well, how many accounting, like tax experts and social audio experts are you going to get in the world? Like at all? Like probably none in Kenya. Maybe one. I don't know. I never heard any of them, but so he came to me and he said, well, can you help out with this? And I'm like, sweet, I can do that. So I went to the Kenyan website, and this is what polymathic type people can do. We take what we already know and just go over. So first thing I know is I've studied Africa before because I know a lot of people there. So what I did one time is I took a map and I colored all of the countries that had been British Commonwealth, because then I know English is one of the primary languages. And then also because Canada is a British Commonwealth, then we also have like similar types of like political systems and education systems. And so I know that the way we think is very similar. And also the tax system is very similar. So I took those things that I knew already and then said, okay, so I went to the Kenyan website and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is a lot like the Canadian tax system. And it was very fast for me to pick up what was going on. So I did a little mini audit of it. And then I went and read their tax law. Well, it didn't take much. So next thing we know, we're on the Twitter space and I'm helping them and I'm asking questions. I guess afterwards they were just like, how did you find this lady from Canada who knows all this stuff about Kenyan tax? Well, I literally studied it like 2 hours, but like I've done 20 years, 7,500 tax returns. And, so I took something I already knew and took social audio. But here's the thing with social audio. You have no visuals. So you have to have someone who has to be able to explain complex tax to people in a way that they understand. Well, like I said, I did 7,500 tax returns from anyone from a recent immigrant who can barely speak English and was not trained in anything the way Canadians think to, multi-million-dollar CEOs. So I'm used to explaining complex ideas in simpler ways that are easy for people to understand, mostly through audio or through like voice. So, anyway, that's just one example of why generalistic type of traits are very important, because you can take something from one field and move it over to another. And then you have this unique luck, if you want to call it. That was maybe luck in lots of ways. I happened to meet somebody who connected me with them. Yeah, you know what? Right there, I probably could have started a business with consulting countries all over the world to help people learn about tax obligations and how to do them through social audio events if I really wanted to. So I probably I would have been the only one in the entire world to do it if I decided to do a business like that. So like that's extremely unique.
Absolutely. And it's not to like, I think people take this idea of maybe like luck as meaning a bad thing. The luck in this context is more used as an all-encompassing term for, and of the 4 kinds of luck, 3 of the kinds of luck are ones that you can obviously influence yourself. And that's the whole point of it, is that having more surface area through uniqueness, or being able to see things differently, or being in motion, learning new things, all of that stuff, that's where the you increase your surface area. And like you said, it leads to any number of options. Obviously, you're not the kind to, or at the time was not the kind to go the consultancy route and do all that stuff. But yeah, it definitely opens up new opportunities for you. What have been some of the more surprisingly transferable skills that you've come across in your time?
Some people ask me, it's funny, like, everyone thinks their own life is just normal to them in many ways. And then when people ask you, you're like, that's interesting to you? Okay. So I didn't know how to articulate any of these until I started doing spaces. And that's the power of, I think, speaking and writing. They're both very powerful. Because you start to articulate things and then you can do it in a teachable way. And so it's through this that I was able to understand something that's specific to me. And then I tested it and was like, oh, okay, this actually works for it actually works for all polymathic types. I was able to test it and then ask others. So yeah, that was kind of my lead up to saying, I would say, well, there's 2 things that I think are the most important and most transferable. So number 1 is curiosity, like a passionate curiosity. Like you just can't, it's insatiable. Like you can't ever, that's what I mean by interesting life. So it can work against us too, because sometimes it's almost ADHD-ish. We can get diagnosed as ADHD when in fact, we're just insanely curious. And as soon as our curiosity is satisfied enough and we can finish whatever it is we have in our mind that we're pursuing, of knowledge, we will move very quickly, or we'll get what some people call a rabbit trail, but it's just a pivot. I don't like to call rabbit trail. I like to say it's a pivot. So this insane curiosity about how the world works, how people work, what knowledge gaps do I have that I'm interested in filling at the time? And it's for lots of reasons. It could be a problem you're solving. It could be because of some trauma you had in the past that you want to resolve. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why we want to fill those curiosity gaps. So number 1, curiosity. And really curious children. I mean, children are all born curious, but obviously we know which ones are born more curious. And by the way, curiosity does not kill the cat. That's just what society says, because they don't want you to keep asking questions or question what they're doing. And then the other key component, and I think these 2 are essential to all else. Everything else kind of jumps off of them. The other one is adaptability. But people will use the word adaptability, but it's very reactive. So adaptability means someone's changed something, and so you have to adapt. And it can be very negative. But I would like to say I've actually changed that. People will say adaptability, but I would actually say it's versatility, because that's proactive. So, and I think that polymaths in general, they can be adaptable and versatile. There's a slightly different nuance to them. And so that's that versatility. So going back to the Kenyan example, so I'm a Canadian tax expert. I've actually even written proposals to the Canadian Federal Canada Budget Committee about how to re-stimulate the economy using a tax change. And so I was able to take that and be versatile and talk to Kenyans who, although they're speaking English, the English is different in some ways, and the tax laws are slightly different, but I was able to be versatile enough to be able, and adaptable both, to their specific needs for their specific audience. So once you have those 2 things, I think those 2 traits, everything else falls into place. Problem solving, because if you're a problem solver, you're curious, and you're also very versatile and adaptable, because some people who are problem solvers, who think they're always going to say what was done before and then solve the problem with what was done before. But a polymathic type brain will say, they will acknowledge what was done before, but it's just a piece of information. It's not a jumping off point necessarily. It's a piece of information in the puzzle. So they'll look at multiple perspectives, which we get through traveling, learning multiple languages, asking people questions, curiosity, obviously, observation, noticing. I would say that polymaths are big time noticers. Like, it's over and above observative. Noticing is like really a little bit more acute. I'll use the word acute, as opposed to just being observative. So, and then I wrote a couple things down because I know you're going to ask me this, just to make sure. Of course, everything else goes, all your meta skills go with that, right? So your critical thinking, your problem solving, strategic thinking, resilience, all of these, but I think they all stem from curiosity and versatility.
Yeah, and I think you talked a little bit in there about being a problem solver, and I've heard you talk before a little bit about the difference between being a problem solver and being a thinker. And do you have a good distinction there in terms of how we can sort of separate those two out, and the maybe the strengths and not necessarily weaknesses of each side, but just what the main distinction is there?
Well, obviously, I think problem solving is more action orientated, right? So it's a solution. I sometimes will like to use the word solutionist, but one of my best friends kind of pushed back on that. And he's like, well, no, you need to ask a lot of questions before you can get to the solution. But a thinker is just thinking. They're not always analyzing. Sometimes they're obsessing. So, reliving the past, trying to rewrite the past, angry at whatever, they're bitter. So a thinker isn't necessarily a proactive solutionist, if you will. So what I call a polythinker is somebody who's looking for multiple perspectives, but their goal is always to be a problem solver, and in the best way possible. And I do understand that there's like secondary effects that can come into play, and we try to minimize those as much as possible, but we're also more like, well, we'll figure out that step when we get to it. Trying to minimize what the secondary or ripple effects or whatever you want to call those are. It's sort of like, I will say that obviously a problem solver is a thinker. I'm just going to give an example of that, just something recent. I just returned from Costa Rica. Was there 3.5 weeks. I was there at the 2-week point, and my husband and I had a whole bunch of our luggage stolen. And 14K in 4 minutes, literally. We were moving Airbnbs. We had everything in our car, and some people must have just been watching us. And I've been to Costa Rica a whole bunch of times already. Like, I've actually lived there. So, but I've never had my passport stolen, and I've traveled all over the world. They didn't mean to take the passports, I don't think, but they were just in baggage that they took. So that was a problem we had to solve. We need to get out of the country. The only way to get home is to get new passports, right? So that's a problem. So most people can solve that problem eventually, to go online, get the website at the embassy. But here's the thing that's a difference between most people. I get a hold of the embassy. This was Friday, the everything got stolen. On Monday morning, I get a hold of the embassy, Canadian embassy, and they're like, okay, when you're flying out? I'm like, Friday. And they said, well, in order to leave on time, you need to be at the embassy at 8 a.m. I'm 5 freaking hours away from the embassy, and I had just drove 4 hours, over the weekend. And that meant that I was going to stay in the capital, which I didn't want to do because I don't want to go to museums and see monuments. I want to be in nature with the monkeys and the sloths and, the toucans and right? I didn't go to Costa Rica to sit in, some massive big city with tons of crime. And so, with nothing to do for the week while they wait for my passports. And so most people would have done the thinking, what do I need to do to get home? And they take the simplest path. The simplest path is go to the embassy like they told you to at 8 a.m. And then you have to wait up to 3 days for a temporary passport. So I started asking questions. Well, I'm like, okay, well, do I have to be there to apply for a new passport? Well, no, I guess you don't. So from my years of doing taxes, this was my goals in taxes. Pay the least amount of taxes with the best outcome within the law. That's literally it. And that's a slider that moves depending on the person. Some people will pay a bit more tax for a better outcome. Maybe it's long-term planning. There's a bunch of things. We move those sliders around. But the law is different than rules. Some rules are unbreakable. You cannot, but they're smaller than people realize. Just because someone tells you something is a rule or that you have to do isn't actually true. So you have to start asking more questions. What's the actual non-movable rule that is non-negotiable, cannot change? Well, in this particular case, the application just had to be there 3 days before we need the passports. Well, so then I said, well, can I courier it to you? And they were like, well, yeah, I guess you could do that. Not many people do. And that's the difference between a problem solver, because my best outcome is that I'm going to spend my time on the Costa Uvita, Costa Rica for the next week, like I planned, and not in the capital waiting for my passports for 4 or 5 days, 3 to 5 days. So that's what I mean by the difference, because a problem solver isn't just about problem solving, like a polymathic one is to get the best outcome possible. So we couriered our new application forms there, and then we went and picked them up before we flew out. And so that actually was the best outcome that we could in the particular situation. So, but the thing is, I'm taking information from other things I've learned. One, government, because I've worked with government doing taxes for so many years, that I understand that there's workarounds, I will call them. What's the workaround? First question, what's the workaround? How do other people do it? What do I know already that I can transfer in? Well, I already know that you don't have to be in person to apply for a passport. So the first thing I'm thinking is, do I have to be in person in a foreign country? Can I take a rule in Canada and apply it in Costa Rica? Turns out I could, but you have to ask the right questions. And I'll, before you go to your next question, I just want to make sure that people understand asking is the most important, one of the most important aspects of problem solving. If someone only asks one or two questions, first, well, how is it done before? I don't want them on my team for the most part, unless they're going to ask more questions. If you ask that question, it's only for information, not because you're going to listen to that, whatever that was. You have to remember that how problems were solved in the past, were for one, maybe for the best for the situation in the past, but we no longer live in the past. We live in a different world. One, that problem may not have been for you. It's the solution isn't for you. And since I've worked with government so freaking long, I understand how a lot of solutions have come to be. It just, somebody made up a decision who was in the right place at the right time, or the right authority, and it was the best that they could come up with. And they sometimes even thought that somebody would just improve it later, but no one ever did. It just stayed like that for years. So the tax systems are exactly that way. They're set up for one male earner where the wife didn't even file a tax return. That's how the entire tax system is set up, and it's still set up that way, even though that's not the way the family system works, the family unit is anymore. So something that worked in the past doesn't always work in the present. So that was my long answer. Asking a lot of questions, and don't feel foolish. So something else that's really important is I don't feel foolish asking questions. It doesn't bother me at all. And if someone thinks I'm a fool for asking them, I really don't care. Like my curiosity and solving the problem the best possible is more important than what somebody thinks of me. So we are willing to be beginners, and that's very unique to polymaths. We will be the beginners time and time again. So every time we learn a new skill, I'm a beginner. I have never, ever consulted for a foreign tax agency before in my life. I've only ever consulted for Canadians. But that didn't stop me from being a beginner. So other people would be like, well, I've never done that before, and you're going to put me on a space with thousands, like literally thousands of people were in this space. And would you do that? I don't know. I wasn't worried about it. I was just like, well, how else are you going to learn? So attitude is everything. And so being a beginner is important. You cannot become an expert if you're not willing to become a beginner. But here's the thing. The more skills you stack, the less of a beginner you are. You're never a beginner. So if I want, I'm learning Spanish, I'm not a beginner language learner. I've already mastered English. So what can I take about English and take over to Spanish? Once I learn Spanish, what do I learn? I want to learn French. What do I know from English and Spanish that I can transfer into French? I'm never a beginner ever. The more I build, the higher I'm starting. I'm starting at an intermediate or just below intermediate level whenever I want to build something. So like for you, I noticed that you were into photography originally before everybody got into video. Well, going in to become a videographer you're never a beginner, because you're taking all the things you learned as a photographer. You're already learning rule of thirds. You're learning exposure. You're learning how to storytell in an image, and high key, low key. There's like all these things. Editing software is very similar. So you're never a beginner as a videographer if you've already been a photographer.
Are there any more examples that come to mind of places in your life where you've gotten better outcomes from breaking some preconceived rules?
Oh, I can think of times when I didn't. I'll give you an example of when I didn't. I was in university, let's say 19 years old, and I saw a posting on the wall at the university looking for hockey announcers. So, and everyone knows Canada's all about hockey. And I thought, hey, I had done some public speaking as a kid, did some training, see students compete in some festivals. And so I thought, hey, why not try out? And I went and I actually auditioned against a whole ton of people, and I won the position. Well, I'm not okay. First of all, this was 30 years ago. I'm not gonna age myself. And it did, and by the way, I don't even know that much about hockey. So, I mean, I know enough, but I used to play soccer and I played it all the way to university. So I'm like, okay, how different can it be? Offside, there's like power plays and penalties, and all at the end of the day, they're very similar. So I just had to learn the language, like that was a power play goal by number 44, Mark Wobeck, like what, in the tone and everything. And I had to learn how to do the advertising. And so I became the hockey announcer for the men's pronghorn men's hockey university team. But I got fired. This would never fly now because I probably could have sued for it, which I don't know that I would have. But the dads refused to go to hockey games announced by female. Turns out I was the very first female in that division in the entire Western Canada to be a hockey announcer. And so that's one of those things. I was willing to be a beginner. I broke the rules. I actually don't, I mean, I understand rules, but they're not always applied to me. And I didn't grow up with them. My mom was 16 when she had me, so she broke all the rules already. So I was born with a lot less, I was born with I had lots of rules, but it's just societal rules weren't as important in our home as it would be in some other ones, I suppose. So that didn't work. Obviously now that would never fly. You could just you couldn't even fire somebody for their gender anymore. So that's where it didn't work, but it didn't make it stop. So that's where it didn't work. So, but you know what? I just picked up my feet and was like, you know what? That's fine. I learned a lot through the entire process. And sometimes you have to realize that you are sometimes the very first one. People aren't ready. I'll have an idea for a solution and people will buck it. They'll be like, even if they think it's a good idea, they just won't, because they haven't had time to think about it. They haven't had enough people. People need time. And I had to learn that the hard way. So I'm not offended I'm very rarely offended if I given a solution to something that I think would work really well, if people don't adopt it, or maybe 3 years later and it's somebody else who suggested it, because I realized that sometimes they just needed someone to be the first one. So, and that's a lesson for everyone. When you have an idea that you think is really good, it doesn't mean it's not a good idea. It just means that people weren't ready for it yet. And you were the first one to bring it, and you started the process for their brain to start thinking. So when the third one got there, for sure, they got all the freaking credit. But it may not have even happened had you not been the first one to start that process. Because if they'd been the first one, they would have got nowhere either. So unless it was like an emergency or something like that. So where it works, an example of where it works. I don't know. I have a bazillion of them. What interests you? Like how could I help you, Blake?
I don't know. That's an interesting question. I think,
or your audience. What's something that they're really struggle with that they could use some?
I mean,
been there, done it.
Truthfully, for me, I guess maybe it's I mean, as I sort of work through things with the podcast and building all this stuff on the side, as I go through my day-to-day marketing stuff, it's mostly and I think I do a good, or I would like to think that I do a good job of this on my own, but just making sure that I'm taking enough time for myself and putting myself out there enough to be in front of people to actually have that surface area that we've been talking about, and making sure that I'm not like sending 2 emails and hoping someone gets back to me, or like DM one person, and if they don't get back to me, it's whatever. It's I understand the importance of networking, but have not always been the best at like following through and actualizing some of that stuff to actually put myself in front of the people that I need to.
So in your particular case, something I think that could work well is if someone responds to you and says no for whatever their reasons are, ask one more question. Be like, hey, is there anyone else you know that you could refer me to? Because the power of a warm intro is probably one of the most powerful networking tools there are. And so because I've already met you in a few spaces, if I wasn't able to adapt to, able to say yes because of my schedule or a number of reasons, if you had said to me, is there anyone else I could ask? Because I said no, I'm probably going to feel obligated to help you out because I don't want to be like, the stuff is all here. I might actually say this. And then I might say, actually, I might know somebody. And then your next is, hey, would you mind introducing me to them? But then your job would make it easy for me. And so when I have done some consulting for people, and what I'll do is hey, I have 3 people I know I can warm intro you to you. And I promise you that 90% of the time, these people get hired. If I put my name on somebody, more than likely somebody else is going to say yes. It might even be higher than 90%. And so, but this is what I do. I'm like, write up the intro for me so that I don't have to do it. So
anything
I still will
make things easier
to make it
for
simpler.
Yeah, exactly.
Say, I can write the warm intro, because first of all, what is it you want from them? How can they help you? What's their time? Time is really important. It takes about this much time. I do all the prep. Like, I think in your case, when you reached out to me, if you had done a little bit more of that, like, it's about this much time. I can, this is what we talk about, as opposed to here's the link to my podcast where I have to go do the work. So reduce my work will help you. But then the warm intro is super important. So I've got before COVID, I used to have my finger on the pulse of a lot of the business in my community. And I used to mentor young adults for 2.5 years. And so anytime they had a job position, they would message me and be like, hey, Samantha, I have a job for this. You know anybody? And if I recommended someone for that job, they got hired every stinking time, every time. Just because one of my friends was divorced, doesn't even have her high school for multiple reasons. And I was at a conference with somebody, and I said, hey, do you have any positions open for this type of work, like secretarial, and I know somebody would be a great fit for you. And he was like, actually, we're actually creating a position like that right now, like literally building an office space for that exact position. And I said, sweet. When does it start? And he said, well, it doesn't start for 2 months. And I said, that's actually a perfect fit. They did interview her, but they told her that they already pretty much hired her before they even interviewed her based on my recommendation. And so that's what I mean by like a warm intro. So use that to your advantage. People who already like you know somebody. People like me know people like me. So anyway, that's my little tip for you.
I'm a big proponent of, so I should say, I've only ever been hired for one job in my life because of what I know and not who I know. So that 100% rings true and is absolutely the way to go about things. I know a lot of people like to give flack to some of the Ramsey Solutions organization, but their career guy, Ken Coleman, talks all the time about the importance of like a resume is great and everything, but the way you actually get a job is by like finding out who works there and getting in interface with the people, whether it's in this day and age, you go on LinkedIn and find out who they know that could be a warm intro to whoever. And like, that's the way to go about getting a job. It's not about putting your resume in a stack of 1,500 other people who are trying to get that same job. So, I sent this to you in the Twitter DM yesterday, but honestly, I think my single largest and realistically only problem that I have right now is this whole networking problem. I want to have more interesting conversations with interesting people, and right now it's a network limitation for me. This is going to sound arrogant or whatever, but I've received a handful of unsolicited positive feedback about the podcast after only like 15 episodes, and it makes me believe that this is where I'm supposed to be, and like this is the project that I should be working on right now. So as we've been talking about polymaths and doing a bunch of different things, I'm really trying to focus head on this one project in my life. So I think I have the ecosystem around it down. It's mostly just this is sort of the one problem that I'm trying to solve. And that's not to say in 3 years it'll be the exact path that I take, but I think focusing on this for the next little bit is probably where I see myself ending up. So
Sweet. So like, okay, what kind of people do you find interesting? Like when you say you want to interview interesting people, what does that mean to you?
that's a tough question.
Not what your audience is going to find interesting. Who do you find interesting?
Yeah, no, I think for me, like all of this started out and will still continue to be an exercise in helping to bring good advice to young men, because I think there's a gap in that right now, and not just from like a societal point of view, but like I feel like that's where I have some personal story that I can help people with. And not to say that my life was difficult by any sort of stretch of the imagination, but I think I've been able to navigate my way through a handful of trivialities that give me a sort of unique perspective on this. So keeping that in mind as a conscientious thing to tie everything back to, but also I just really love having intellectual conversations, and I found that I was not having the outlet of being able to find that in my day-to-day life, whether that be a consequence of location or circumstance or what have you. But we have the internet now, and that's able to facilitate more of these conversations. So that's sort of where I've ended up. So
there is a fairly new podcast called, I gotta look it up in a minute. Global. I'll look it up while we're chatting here a minute. I would definitely recommend going through their podcast list because they're looking at some of the same types of people you are, and then just like literally asking all the people they are said yes to them, because they're more than likely going to say yes to you. So there, here's the similarities that we can pick up from that. Well, one, they're willing to say yes to a new podcast, which not everybody is. Two, they've already vetted out the kinds of people you're looking for: interesting, creative, the kind of people you find interesting. And a lot of these people are thought leaders already. So there's a place right there. And, I'm going to say this out loud, but I don't like saying it like this, but I'm just going to. Essentially, you need to feed people's ego. So if you're like, hey, you were on the global interview and, I thought you had some really great things to say. I find you really interesting. Heck, I like it when people say I'm interesting. Everyone wants to hear that. Like things that you like hearing, other people like to hear too. I find you interesting. I'm a new podcast too, just like they were. And, I would love to have you on my show. Boom. This is your requirements. Like your time constraints, what we're going to talk about. And the nice thing about the global interview is, and I'm just going to give you a tip about them. So he's got the podcast. Unfortunately, he has not backlinked it very well, but most of the people that he's interviewed on the podcast are also people that he's done a written review. And I don't know if you saw mine, but he did a magazine publication review interview with me in June of last year. And then they did a podcast one with me later. I wish you would interlink them so you could just go back. But then for you, all your research is done because he's already done an interview for you. So, so there's an idea right there about how you can leverage this. And the thing is, a lot of the people that he's interviewed know each other. And so that will help you too. Oh, I interviewed Samantha. Now guess what? You can like literally use that because a lot of the people he's interviewed know who I am. So, hey, I interviewed Samantha. She said yes. Boom.
No, it's great insight, and it's all like stuff that I'm thinking about and well versed in, and like really just trying to absorb as much of that information. Is just making sure that I get out of my comfort zone in actually asking for the things that I want. So,
but you've already done that. Like you asked me, and I mean, you asked me, I was like, oh, okay, because usually small podcasts are a little more nervous about that sort of thing. But you asked me, and you got past that. It wasn't scary. I said yes. I don't always say yes to new podcasts because I get burned. It's not necessarily because they're small, but I've been on podcasts and they don't do any referral links at all. And I'm like, so I gave you, it's probably 3 hours of my time between the chit chat before. And then, I kind of look at what's your podcast about? I might even listen to one, and I kind of curate my thoughts before we talk, because I might have been talking, like I run a farm. So I might've been talking about marketing grain, an hour before we get on the line. It's not like a specialist where your brain is in the same mode all the time. I literally have to flip a switch, turn things off or pivot. So it takes a lot for me to like move over. So, and that's what I said to you. I'm like, are you going to backlink? You know, because if I'm going to give you my time, what are you going to do in return? So that's really important to let people know. So I am way more fussy about the podcast I go on now. If there's not going to be any like, thank you. Like for me, that's gratitude when you're like, hey, if you want to check Samantha out, go to her website, samanthapostman.com. And I've got a new initiative starting up pretty soon called Polythinkers. And we're probably going to be launching that up starting in January. Most of the planning's done for that. I've got a new partner for that. So yeah, and that will help you out too if you let people know this is what you're going to get in return.
And I try in my life to lead in a lot of places with gratitude. And I understand that being a small podcast, the onus is on me to really provide some sort of value for people's time, whether that's making them think something different about themselves when they leave, or whether it's just providing a well-researched and not the same podcast they've done 50 times prior to that. So I really take pride in myself of like knowing that I am in the early stages of this and knowing that I have to be able to provide at least some sort of tangential value on the back end for these lovely people like yourself who provide me with an hour of your time. So I hope
what
that I'm
else can I
doing a
help
good
you
job.
with? What else can I help you with? I mean, you can ask me more questions if you want, but like I feel like helping, that it's a good use of my time too. And we teach as we're helping people. That's a really good way to teach.
Of course. I think maybe one thing for me is you seem to have a handful of strategies in terms of like learning to learn and picking up all these new skills. And learning for me is a big thing, but I often wonder if I'm taking the most, and perhaps the most direct path isn't always the correct path, but a more direct path to picking up new topics quicker to be able to more confidently speak on a handful of different things. So what are your sort of tips for learning to learn and building some of those meta skills?
Again, all things I have never articulated before. I just like, I have one of my best friends who died actually in May, would ask me these questions. I'm like, what? People do that? Like there's some strategy to it. And some things are very conscious. Like when I do tax, I'm very conscious of the strategies I'm using. Especially when people ask me to teach them to them. But when it comes to learning, it's just things you just innately do. Like if you were to say to Leonardo da Vinci or Elon Musk, how do you learn so fast? They would take a bit. They'd be like, wait, what? Like, I don't know. How do I do that? For us, it's like walking. But I started to realize that there are some fundamental basics. So number one is I think one of the most important things you can do is build your confidence first, because when people have confidence, they're more willing to stand tall and then try something after. So number one, build your confidence first. I didn't know that's what I was doing. So this is how you do it. What do I already know that I can transfer in? So let's use videography. Like I know this is something that you already done, but it's something you're familiar with. So what do I already know about videography? Right. Well, if you use Adobe Photoshop, well, you would be able to take on Adobe Premiere quite easily because it's all the same tools, the same language. You know, it's just now instead of using layers on Photoshop, you're now using, the layers are just slightly different the way they do them in Premiere, tracks and timeline. What do I already know? What can I transfer in? You also know how to tell a story because in photography, you need to tell a story in one photo. Well, videography is very similar, right? How do we not overstimulate the audience with information while giving the right amount of information in a pleasing aesthetic way? You already know how to do that because you have photography. So can you still build your photography skills? For sure. But here's the cool thing that happens. As you build your videography, it will backfill your photography and you'll get better at photography. And that's the thing that people don't understand. They're just like, well, I have the specialty, but I promise you that if you add another layer, another skill set, especially if it's somewhat related, you will automatically become better at your specialty. It happens because you're adding more perspective that you didn't have before. And so that's number one. So build your confidence. What do you already know? And then where's your gaps? Right. So that's the well, actually, I would say practice your confidence first at the beginning, like just looking at them, getting them down. Because like I'll use the example of when I was trying to learn Spanish. I went online and I was like, what's the symbol? Like I literally went online. First thing I did was, what are all the commonalities between English and Spanish? Because obviously I know English. And so some guy, Synergy Spanish, wrote 1,001 words. They're almost exactly the same in English. They're just slightly different. So university is universidad. So anything with a TY pretty much becomes DAD in Spanish. Shit, I now know 1,000 Spanish words. like that's confidence building right there. Okay, so we call those English cognates or things, but so that builds my confidence up, and I can practice those right away. And when I speak in Spanish, I will use those words on purpose. But here's the cool thing. I'm just going to add this to go to the back. So I just came back from a month in Costa Rica. Obviously, English isn't the first language of most people there, and even people who speak it really well, they're not native speakers. But I also taught English, which is a bit of a story. I should tell that story before we finish. Remind me of that one. I was teaching English in Costa Rica, but when I'm in an international country, I will speak simpler English because I'm backwards filling, because I know how hard it is to learn, and I know how important English cognates are. So I will simplify my English. So when I'm speaking to somebody, instead of saying this is if this is hard doesn't have a word in English and Spanish, but I will say difficult, because in Spanish is difícil. So I will adjust my English. So one thing that when I did spaces, I speak really fast too, and I can slow down, but when I was doing spaces, people would tell me all the time how easy my English was to understand. Well, one, I think it's because in Canadian West, we sound like Hollywood, and they're used to that like accent, if you will. My husband likes to say we have no accent in the west of Canada because we sound like Hollywood. But anyway, it's a bit of a joke. But one, I think, is the accent they're used to because of watching TV. But two, I simplify my English to make it so words that they're used to. So my English gets better when I'm speaking to internationals simply because I'm learning Spanish. All right, so now you're filling in your gaps. What do I need to know first? So this is emergency. I need to know how to say, how do I do this? Where's that? How do, that's the problem with language programs. They teach you freaking everything. Like the horse drinks water. No joke, Rosetta Stone, milk. The Rosetta Stone actually had me teaching me saying the horse drinks milk. When the frick is a horse ever going to say that? Like, never. Plus, I'm hardly ever going to use the word horse. I don't eat horse. It's not on the menu. Like when are you ever going to say that? Anything so that's the next thing that polymaths will do. What do I need to learn first? And then what's the most important? So when I'm traveling English or Spanish is the most important. And it's interesting to me because I'm solving a problem. I need to solve the most urgent problems. And then that builds confidence because I'm using words and getting better at it. And then I can start to add on to it. So that's basically it. Like those are like the fundamentals, like build your confidence, fill your gaps. But the gaps you want to feel first are the ones that are closest to you, not someone that someone else tells you. So maybe eventually you want to do I'm using Spanish now. I switched from videography to Spanish just because I came back from Costa Rica. So let's just say I want to do conferences in Spanish. Well, that's a long ways out. Like I'm going to take me a long time, but I'm not even practicing in that. But I need to learn travel Spanish first because the second I land, I now need to know how to get to the air, how to get to my rental agency, how to read the contract, whatever. So those are the fundamentals, and like just have fun. If it's not interesting to you, let it go, or make it interesting. So what I call is like a reframe. So make it interesting. There are things that I don't like, but when I make it interesting or give it a reframe or a purpose, all of a sudden I get excited about it. And reframes are very, very important. So I'll give you an idea of a reframe. This is something about polymathics are more like this too. So they're always like, how come like most people see roadblocks. So you come to a problem, it's a roadblock. So a roadblock or a wall. We'll even say that. We use those terms. Or obstacle, right? An obstacle is another one. Well, depending on the person, how big that obstacle look. It might look so big you can't see on the other side. I don't look at things like that ever. I look at things as hurdles.
Hurdles are meant to be jumped over.
Well, actually, so now you just followed society's rules. I don't follow society's rules. So I didn't realize this is where I got it from. I used to be a track runner and I did sprinting. And so I was on the track all the time. There's always hurdles on there. I wasn't a hurdle jumper myself, but they're always on the track, especially when you're doing sprinting because they're on the main track. But here's what's cool about hurdles. One, you can see the finish line, right? Can see right through them. But here's the thing with hurdles. The only time you need to jump them is when you're actually running a race, which timed for ribbons. I don't need your freaking ribbon. I just want my own ribbon. I just need to get to the finish line. How I get there is up to me. I can go around that thing. I can go under, because you have to remember that hurdle might be set for a 6-foot guy. I'm 5'5" and I can't jump as high. I might have to go under that thing, right? Or I can push it over. There's a lot of things I can do. I don't have to follow everyone's rules. The only thing I need to do is get to the finish line. How I get there is up to me. But everything you encounter, life is not a bunch of obstacles. It's a bunch of hurdles. Everything is a hurdle. They're different sizes, different weights, whatever they are. You just have to figure out how to get around them or through them or under them or whatever it is to get to the finish line. And there's going to be more hurdles along the way. Anyone who thinks there's one hurdle in your life is just like, that's a problem. People who think, oh, I shouldn't have any problems in my life. Well, no wonder you shut down, because you're angry at the hurdle. Hurdles is just a whole bunch of them before you get to the finish line. And that finish line can be of the day or your lifetime, whatever that is. So that's a reframe. When you look at a problem, and it might be something you don't like, as a hurdle, that reframe in itself can take a lot of the resentment, the bitterness, and all the things that keep you from overcoming it away. So it's just a reframe. Actually, thinking about writing, I have a book mind, an idea of like all these reframes I do. And that's like one of them is hurdles instead of obstacles or walls. So let's go back to the Costa Rica story. So in 2017, my daughter was talking about, she's my youngest child, and she was talking about becoming a teacher. She was in high school, grade 11. And I thought, man, so in where I live, it's a 5-year program, and you could be out $80,000 to go to school for 5 years to become a teacher. So I thought to myself, she wasn't sure, really. She was really good. She used to teach in Sunday school, freaking amazing at it. And she wasn't sure. And she was kind of leaning towards not going in. And I thought, well, there's two things here. One, she's either going to regret not going and wish she did, or two, she's going to spend $80K in 5 years of her life and hate it and wish she didn't, because, maybe I told her to, or, she felt pressure, whatever it is. And so I thought, how can we solve this problem? And so I convinced my husband, very traditional, conservative Christian guy, to take my daughter out of school for a semester. And we went to Costa Rica and did a teaching English as an additional language certification, which is basically a minimal viable career. So she went to an alternate school in Alberta, which was $6K a year. And so I took her out for one semester. So the $3K that I saved for her to go to school, we spent towards towards her getting her certification. So here she is, 16 years old. And we moved to Costa Rica for 2 months. And we lived in hostels with 18 to 30-year-olds, like hostels. So this is not like the nice kind. Like, this is the kind that are super basic. You're pretty much glamping. Well, it's a little over glamping. And we lived there for 2 months. So the first month we got our certification while volunteer teaching. And then we volunteer taught this. We stayed on because we're already there. We stayed on and volunteer taught the second month. I don't need to teach. The farm makes enough money. And for me, it's just an adventure and one more fun thing to do. She was freaking amazing at it. And she decided not to go into teaching in like a traditional sense, the way this was done. But she learned Spanish while we were there. Here's where I'm bucking the system, right? So at the school, all the teachers were just blown away that I pull her out of school to do this. And she did have to internet school. But here's all the cool things that came from that. So one, obviously we got some bonding. I took her out of French and put her into Spanish, which in my personal opinion is more useful in the West anyway, if you're traveling. And here's the thing. I'm going to fast forward a little bit for her. She took 1 year of university. She became into editing publisher. So that's actually language based, right? she did that. There's more of that story about why she went into that, but we'll leave that for another day. She was 1 year at Simon Fraser University in just outside Vancouver in the Valley. And over COVID, everybody got sent home, like all the other students. And so she's got 1 year of undergrad. There's only 2 universities in all of Canada that do what she wanted in undergrad when she went. So that's why she went to Vancouver. And but then after 1 year, the school's going to close some more because there's so many international schools at that particular school. It's basically an international intake school. And so they're going to close again, and everything was online. And by the way, my daughter made the dean's list over COVID. when hardly anybody else did. And she's not like a rock star student. She's good, but that's because she had internet schooled on her own already, self-paced school, had practice before everybody else did it. So here's the cool thing that happened to her. She's at home and I'm like, well, first of all, you need to go back to Simon Fraser because everybody's moved to an online world. I have a master's, by the way, that I got at 40 online before online was a thing. It's from Chicago, actually, and I live in Canada. So I'm very well aware of what you can do online. And so I said to her, well, if you don't have to go to that school, well, you can go anywhere in the world now. So we started looking up her program worldwide. And obviously want to work on a Canadian dollar because that's crazy if you go to the US, you pay national fees. But we found a university in Toronto called Ryerson, and they had a graduate program for publishing. Here's what the website said. Recommended undergrad, 4-year degree, or 21 with industry experience. Well, she doesn't meet either of those. But this is what a polymathic person will do. The word was not required. The word was recommended. So to me, the door is unlocked. But everybody else sees required. So I said to her, why don't you apply and see what they say? And she's like, well, Mom, I'm 19 years old. Well, she was 18 years old. I'm 18 years old. I only have 1 year of undergrad. This ain't happening. I've never worked in the industry other than she had edited my master's program. So she did the interview, and here's what got her in. She had her teaching English as a foreign language. It's a university certified program. She got when she was 16 years old. She had already edited all my masters. I had a 4.0. And they looked at all her international travel, and they basically said to her, heck, it's COVID, and they let her in. She skipped 3 years of university and saved herself like some insane $50,000. And she has a graduate. She's a graduate certification, and she graduated before her 25th. She was 20 years old, and she was before they're even allowed to be in, usually at 21. And so it ended up saving her an insane amount of money. She skipped the line, and she got to do what she loved and didn't have to take all these courses she didn't want to do anyway, which that's another story. But this is what I'm saying. And that was a long way of saying the decisions you make in the moment, sometimes breaking the rules or the norms of societal things, sometimes later, what you're calling luck surface, increased her luck surface for later. So she got into a university, and then she was done in 2 years, loved what she did. And she's already working. She's edited a bunch of books that are on Amazon. By the time she was 19 or 20, she'd already edited a book on Amazon and well paid. So like, that's what happens when you're willing to solve a problem that you have in a creative way.
I can't think of a more perfect example for why it's important to continue to think outside the box in some of these ways. Samantha, I appreciate your time. And where should we send people to find all your stuff?
Yeah, like I've got my SamanthaPostman.com. You can sign up for my newsletter. I'm definitely not as consistent as I could be, simply because I'm so busy living a huge life that I don't always have time to write about it in a way that people, in a writable way. But I do write sometimes. I'm on Twitter or X. If you look at my account, I had actually 14 million. I had 14 million reach in March, and now it's practically nothing with the new algos. And then I kind of went off for a month, which is totally bad for my social media. But when I was in Costa Rica, I just took some time to just focus on relationship and being in Costa Rica. So I'm going to be starting up some Twitter spaces again, but you can definitely find me over on Twitter. Usually respond to my DMs if you've got a verified account. Otherwise, and if you are polymathic, yeah, like if you go to my website, if you go 3/4 way down, you can sign up to hear the updates about this Polythinkers community and initiatives that we're starting in January. So I've started to realize, well, some time ago, I realized that polymathics need a place to be. It's exactly like what you said. We need a place to intellectually discuss and not talk about weather. There is an importance for talking about weather, I do think, actually, because you can kind of test somebody's temperature about where they're at based on how they interpret the present weather, and so they're revealing something about themselves the way they tell weather, but that's about as interesting as the weather gets to me. So other than, well, for the farm, obviously I need to care a lot about weather. But if you want intellectual speaking, we do some cool stuff. I've been running this group for 2 years in beta. Kind of on a small scale. We do some cool stuff like get unstuck, where someone tells a problem and then everybody just kind of like goes in and jumps in and like all these ways you can solve that problem creatively and comes up with an action plan in a very short period of time. So we do some cool stuff in there. So yeah, that's how you can find me. I do have a YouTube channel. I've kind of paused it for a while when my best friend died in March. I had to take care of his estate, and we're digitalizing his estate so that he can become a chatbot. And so I just kind of had to let some things go while I work on other projects. So, but I'm hoping to kick that back up soonish. So anyway, thanks, Blake. You've been a great host. You did really great on asking some really good questions. You did your homework. Holy cow. I was super impressed in the first few minutes. I was like, whoa, I didn't even remember half that stuff. But thank you again for having me on today. And I hope, like, something that I asked you is like, why are you having me on for men? But I think that what we forget is that women sharpen men and men sharpen women. I do think that it's important for each of us to have our own spaces, and that's one of our biggest cultural traversities is that we've blended men and women too much in lots of places, but in other places not enough. And so I appreciate you willing to speak to me, and hopefully I added value to your audience for things that can transfer between genders.
Of course, I don't think, and I said this to you in the DM here, but I don't think good wisdom discriminates against who it comes from. So, is it as hyper tailored as it could be? Maybe not, but the grand outcome is going to be that you just learn good and interesting things. So, I appreciate your time, and thanks for coming on. And yeah.
If you ever want to ask specific questions that you want to ask women about men, let me know, because I used to mentor just men's groups sometimes, and holy cow, the stuff they ask you, I was like, it's stuff that they want to ask but just don't have any female to ask in a very open and direct way. So yeah, we could always do that sometime too if you like.
Of course. Perfect. Thanks, Samantha.
All right.
Appreciate it.